People who know that I'm a decision theorist often ask me, okay, here I have a problem for you, help me make a decision. And I feel that often there is some kind of unrealistic expectation of what the field can do for people, and take some time to explain, look, I'm a decision theorist, it doesn't mean that I know what the correct decision is. And I think it is important to understand how we can use these models of decision making. I think there are two extremes, maybe there's a whole spectrum between them. There are classes of problems in which indeed you could write down the problem in a mathematical way, apply a mathematical algorithm, find the right solution, that's it. An example, you want to get in a city from point A to point B, you tell me whether it's point A and point B, you tell me what are your criteria, the shortest path, the prettiest, whatever. Suppose you say the shortest. I put it on an algorithm, Google Maps or whatever, and I calculate the fastest route. We have algorithms for this for decades, and that's the simplest way to do it. And I find the shortest argument and say, it doesn't feel right, my intuition was to go this way. I say, come on, intuition, with all due respect, here is the algorithm, we formulated your problem, we know what you want, that's the correct answer. Next, suppose that you come to me and say, I have this amount of money I want to invest, what should I do? You're a decision theorist, tell me, well, how should I invest it? And here my answer is, I don't know. There are many possible scenarios out there. I don't know where to get the probabilities for these. It's a matter of intuition. I would guess that if you have a lot of money, your intuition is probably better than mine, because how come you ended up with so much money? Probably you know how to invest, okay? So who am I to tell you? And yet, I think that decision theorists can help you in trying to take your decision in this extreme. Even after you made it, you have your own intuition as to what's the correct decision. And I'm asking you, okay, let's try to think, what did you put into it? For instance, we adopt this model of expected utility maximization. Okay? We can have a debate of whether this is the right model or not, but let's, for the sake of the argument, agree that this is the model you want to work with. And then I say, let's try to think, what is your utility function? And what are your probabilities that justify this kind of a decision? So maybe, we'll think about something else. You choose a career and you tell me, I like it, and say, let's try to think, what about it do you like? And it turns out that you like a lifestyle, or maybe you like the social aspect because you think it's very respectable and all your friends are going to envy you. That's fine. That could be part of your utility function. But talking to me might make you face it, and you have to say, do I want to put so much weight on the way I'm viewed by my friends or not? If so, perfectly so. Yes, but just putting it down in a formal model might make you contrast these kind of beliefs, decisions in this case, but also beliefs. In the case of beliefs, suppose that you are taking your money out of one investment, putting it in another or something, and I'm trying to say what it is that you have in mind. What are the scenarios you think about? You'll have to write down the scenarios, you'll have to see what kind of probabilities would make sense, would justify this decision. Again, it's your own beliefs, okay? But the model can help you see whether it makes sense, whether this is the kind of decisions you want to make or not. Okay? In between, there are many situations of dialogues. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that often people have a feeling that either you go all the way with a mathematical model or you ignore it completely. Either you just go with your intuition or you relegate it all to a computer. And the truth, I think, is that most decision situations are in between. So in the mathematical model, you can say, okay, you have these very sophisticated mathematical models of, the stock market, and I'm using all these sophisticated integrals that many people can't understand. They'll just buy it like this because they can't understand, so they think it comes out of the computer, it must be correct. And then people are sometimes disappointed, be it because of a crash like in 2007-8, or for other reasons they say, I don't like it, I don't like the decision that I ended up making, or something like that. On the other extreme, people say, all this is rubbish and I just have my intuition. These are possible extremes, but again, I think typically we need a dialogue. We need a dialogue where someone says, okay, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, this is what I feel strongly about, this is where I'm hesitating. Let's try to sort through my intuitions. Let's try to put them in a more formal language. It's not that the model would give me the correct answer, but it would be a sort of a prop, sort of a way to check my own logic. Now, this relates to two other issues. One is the notion of rationality, and the other one is the way that we use models in economics at large. So let me start with rationality. So we have this definition of rationality as robustness, basically. So you make a certain decision and it's rational for you if when I confront you with the analysis of that, you don't feel bad about it. You like the decision, you keep it this way. But we can try to refine it and distinguish between two notions of rationality. One, which we call the objective rationality, would mean something that practically every reasonable person would accept. Okay, so today if I tell you, look, smoking is bad for you. Smoking damages your health. You could still try to avoid this, but we have a lot of data today that will say that's probably the case. On the other hand, if we talk about the risk of cellular phones, I don't think that the scientific data is so clear out there. Global warming might be in between. People still debate on whether we have evidence of what's going on and the effect of human interaction in global warming. So there could be things where I don't have necessarily a way to convince you. Science has many open problems that for various reasons we cannot resolve. And then you could, as a decision maker, you could do whatever you like. However, you are subjectively rational if you feel okay with your own decision. So objectively rational is something that I can say, I can convince any reasonable person that that's the right thing to do. Subjectively rational only means I cannot convince you that this is the wrong thing to do. Okay? So it's not necessarily the choice that everyone else would make, but it's something that you could defend as a decision maker who's sort of what you call reasonable, of course, has to be defined. Eventually it's going to depend on many empirical notions of which society we're talking about, what do I mean by convince, all these things that would need to be clarified if you really want to apply this. But the notion is that there are more than one type of rationality. Okay? One is so to speak on the offense, the other one is on the defense. The other thing I would like to relate it to is what good are models in economics in general. Economics is considered to be a very successful science, not only by economists. I mean, some other people also think it's a successful social science. It's definitely the most mathematically sophisticated social science. Economists are doing well in many ways. Students like to study economics and so on. But people confront this success with the fact that economists don't seem to predict things like, financial crisis, and economists are using all the wrong assumptions, as every assumption that is used in economics has been proven wrong by psychologists like, Kahneman, Tversky, and their followers. And there are many reasons for critique, and some of it also critiques which are more postmodern in line that say it's not just that it's a wrong theory, but it's actually the wrong theory for the wrong reasons, namely that people who promote certain lines of economic theory do it for their own interest. And you see, for instance, the people who support free markets also happen to be on boards of firms and make a lot of money and so on. So it's not even, they don't even attempt to be objective. I mean, there's some interest behind it. Now, I should say that all three types of critiques are relevant and valid and important, and economists should heed these kind of warnings. But we also have to take them in proportion. So, on the last one, I don't have much to say about the fact that when we're dealing with science, we have our own subjective interest in the back of our minds. That's probably always true. The only thing we can do is try to avoid them. I mean, it's not... it's very important insight going back to Foucault, if not much earlier, that whatever you do in a social context might be an act that serves certain power groups. All I can say is that we should try to cope with that. I mean, just like we cannot be perfectly objective, doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Similar to the fact that I can tell you I don't believe that we'll ever have eternal peace, but it doesn't mean that we should start shooting each other. Okay, we'll never have eternal peace, at least let's try. But I'm afraid I don't have much more to say about that. On the critique of financial crisis, one thing should be fair to the profession and to say that financial crises are a very complex kind of phenomenon. And we know from various theories, including chaos theory in physics, that when you have a very complex system, you might not be able to predict what's going on later on. The butterfly effect and these kind of phenomena are there. So if you think about physics, which is a very successful science that has found out all the basic flow equations and everything, and still has problems predicting, when applied, has problems predicting earthquakes and hurricanes and things like that, who are we to even try to predict financial crisis? We have two problems as compared to physics. One is that we don't have the basic flow equations. Okay, so we don't have the basic science that established and works at least in the lab. We're not there. And the other one is that we're dealing with a system that reacts to our theories. Okay, so the description of the theory of the system can change it. If you predict a hurricane in 2 days, it's not going to come 1 day earlier. But if you predict a financial crisis in 2 days, it will come 1 day earlier. So we have to be, I think, fair to the economics profession and say this is probably not what we are after. Okay, there are many other things that we can do. We are doing much better in situations that can be isolated in laboratory experiments, not like the entire financial world or the entire globe, but something that can be isolated and can be experimented with, then economics does indeed do better. The other important thing is that with assumptions that are false. And the question is, how can you learn anything from assumptions that are false? And actually, economists have been bothered by this since Milton Friedman in the 1950s. There's a lot of discussions of these things. I will not try to summarize everything. I'll just try to suggest two ways to look at it that might be a little bit new. One is that part of the reasoning that we do in economics is not by rules but by cases, not by general theories but by analogies. Now, reasoning by analogies is something that we see in psychology. It exists everywhere. In statistics, we have similar techniques. I mean, I will not get into details, but often what's called non-parametric statistic is closer to reasoning by analogies than to reasoning by general rules. And there's no reason that in the philosophy of science we would not have the two types of reasoning. So the classical Popperian view of science is to find general theories or general rules, and then you have a counterexample, you have to go back and rework it and refine it. But if you think now of a certain model not as a general statement, not a universal quantifier there for every blah 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 there will be, etc., but rather you say this is sort of an example, a theoretical thing, theoretical case I would call it, but something that helps you think about situations in the world. And next time you see a situation, you ask yourself, oh, is it similar to that or to this? And then when you think about a model and an example of a refutation thereof, suddenly there is no conflict. Because you see the theoretical model which says one thing, and you see the experiment that was run in the lab that says something else. Now, the event you're interested in, you ask yourself, is it more similar to this or to that? Okay? Because cases do not contradict each other because they do not contain any universal quantifier that says for every. Okay? And I think this captures much of the way that many economists feel, economic theories or applied game theories feel that our models provide a lot of insight and do a lot of good, and yet they seem to be very simplified and the assumptions are never correct, and people ask us, how could you learn something from a model that's not true, from a false model? And I think part of the answer is that sometimes we think in a way that is more case-based and rule-based, in a way that's more analogical than general theories. The other the other way to look at economic models is to say, let's pretend for a second that economics is not only about prediction. We're not trying to make predictions. Our job is to critique. We're standing there and we hear arguments in the public domain. A politician says something, a journalist says something else, and you come and say, wait a minute, there's a problem in this argument. Okay? And suppose that this is our role. Our role is just to be there in the public sphere and to say, for instance, you look over the shoulder of someone and say, there's a mistake in your proof. I'm not saying what should be written there, but this argument doesn't work. Or what you're describing is not an equilibrium. So it's a nice story, but people would react and therefore something would happen and so on. Or even what you're describing doesn't match the data. It's a nice idea, but you see the data show something else. Okay? An example could be of this could be the Laffer curve in the 1970s, where Laffer convinced the Ford administration that increasing the tax rate doesn't necessarily result in higher income from taxation or higher revenue from taxation. So he drew on a piece of paper, on a napkin, he drew this curve that got his name on it. It says, if you start at zero rate, then of course you get zero taxes. If you put 100%, then no one would bother to work, and then you also get zero taxes. And in between you have this kind of curve. Very simplified model, just kind of a toy thing. All it was really doing is testing a certain line of reasoning that says we need more money, let's raise taxes in the hope of getting higher revenue. Okay? Does it say what was the right thing to do? No. Economists even today think that maybe it was wrong. Maybe they were on this part of the curve where increasing the tax rate could have increased revenue. But the contribution was still just to show that there is a flaw in an existing argument. Now, if you compare economists to historians, you say, look, historians everyone knows that we need them, we love them, but no one would ask a historian for predictions. Serious historians would not tell you what's going to happen. They say, look, I studied the past, I'm not a fortune teller. If you compare economics to that, you say maybe what the good that we do for society is just to test coherence of arguments, to test the reasoning, and that's another way in which economics can be useful. Now, if you take that point of view, and I'm not saying it's the only one, I'm not saying it's the only contribution of economics, but if you take that, you could suddenly see how a simple model that's obviously false can still convey a very important point and explain to people why a certain line of reasoning that they thought was very cogent is actually not. So I think that these are two ways to look at why economic models can be useful, even if the assumptions they make are false. And it helps us to think about what we can expect of models in economics, similar to the idea of what we expect of the models in decision theory that sometimes are only to test the logic of a decision that you already made, not with the help of the model. Often we have events for which we can calibrate the probability or estimate it from past events, and we say, okay, we toss a coin over and over again, and I'm asking you what's the probability it's going to come up head, and you look at the past 100 cases and you take this as an estimate of that. And often we actually define probability by this very notion of empirical frequency, and that's the way you'd explain it to your little brother. If your brother would ask you, what do you mean by probability? Probably you would give an explanation that's based on the law of large numbers, only take the law of large numbers as a definition of probability, which is a little bit like turning it upside down, because the law of large numbers says that when you have many events that have the same probability and are independent and the average converges to the probability, you need probability to understand that. And that's Bernoulli in early 18th century. But typically, intuitively, we actually use this as the definition of probability. And that's what we call objective probability, more or less objectively given. You could try it, everyone could toss the coin so many times, everyone can look at a deck of cards and play with it, and so on. But there are events for which we don't have such empirical frequencies. And the wonderful example by Blaise Pascal was when he at some point became much more of a philosopher than a mathematician, and he tried to explain to a putative conversant as to why you should believe in God. And this is known as Pascal's wager. I mean, the argument basically goes that, the standard way we think about it is that it's safer to bet on the existence of God than not. The actual argument is really wonderful. It's very nuanced, because Pascal starts by telling us, either there is God or there isn't. So he's talking about what we call today like states of the world. We could be living in this world or that world, and you could choose to become a believer or not. He's also sensitive to the fact that you don't just choose what to believe, but you could maybe work on yourself to eventually become a believer. And then his first argument is an argument about what we now call in modern theory dominance, that one act is simply better than the other no matter what. So no matter what state of the world I'm at, this act gives you a higher payoff. And His argument is basically, look, if God does not exist, what have you lost? And if God exists, you gain life in heaven. And then he goes on with this putative discussion, says, should you say that to believe in God costs you something? Because there are all these carnal pleasures that are awaiting you on earth, and you have to give them up if you want to become a believer. But then he says, well, whatever awaits you here on earth is finite, and the afterlife is infinite. And therefore, in modern language, you would say that even if the probability that God exists is very, very small, as long as it's positive, the small number times the infinite payoff beats any finite payoff that you could get here. And in modern language, we would call it expected utility. Expected utility theory says you should take the possible outcomes, assign certain numbers that we call them utility to say how desirable they are, so a more desirable outcome gets a higher utility. To the different scenarios, you assign probabilities, okay? And then what you do is calculate what we call mathematical expectation, namely probability times value plus probability times value. You add them up, and you get expected utility, and you choose the act that gives you a higher expected utility. And since Pascal was the person who invented the notion of mathematical expectation, there was little doubt that this is what he had in mind. But the amazing thing in this argument, and back, 1650s we're talking, the probability that God exists cannot possibly be something which is an empirical frequency. It's not like we have witnessed many universes and some God did exist and some did not. That's not the story. So evidently what we have in mind when we think about the probability that God exists is something else. It's not the empirical frequency. So what is it? And what Pascal really has in mind is, I'd say again, in modern term, I would rephrase it as the following. We have this beautiful machinery of probability theory. It works perfectly nicely when we have statistics and we have the data. But maybe we could use it also when we don't have the data. Maybe even if we don't have the objective probabilities, like what's the probability that my car be stolen, yes, no, make a decision about insurance or something like that. Even if it's only yes or no that I cannot repeat, I don't have empirical frequencies over, still the discipline put on my reasoning by the mathematical model can allow me to reach a better decision. And a better decision here, I would say, and I would stress it throughout, would be in my own eyes. Because at the end of the day, you ask me, in Pascal's case, should I or should not become a believer? And the argument is, I think that I thought about it in a more reasonable way. I think I clarified things to myself. And it's not that we necessarily have to buy the argument. There are lots of discussions in the philosophical literature until today about that. And it's quite obvious that if you were to take it seriously, they have to say, wait a minute, which God? Because could be different gods and they demand different things, and each one of them can send you to hell for different things. There's no way to appease all of them. So what I'm trying to say is not to believe in God necessarily, but to believe in Pascal, because Pascal was amazing, being a believer himself, in phrasing the question this way and in coming up with some of the most basic ideas of decision theory, which is the decision matrix, separating what you can do from what you cannot control in the states of the world, using probability machinery to quantify your beliefs even when it doesn't have the empirical frequency idea. The expected utility idea, which is used till today, it's the most important or most popular idea in economics, finance, decision theory. Then there was the idea of expected utility appeared more explicitly in the works of Daniel Bernoulli in the early 18th century, but I would say it was left dormant for about 200 years. And basically there were development in statistics, but there wasn't much going on in social science as such. In the sense of mathematical approach to decision making was not very common. Economics made progress, but in a relatively not very mathematical way, somewhat less related to individual decision making. There were many writings in the 19th century that were influenced by cognitive psychology, or what we'd call today cognitive psychology, but the argumentation was rather intuitive, and the whole notion of science was at the time less well-formed. And things changed dramatically in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Logical positivism came to the rise in defining of what science should be like, mostly dealing with physics. But apparently economists adopted that around 1930s. Economists wanted to have the science which is real respectable science, like physics or something, which in particular meant that any theoretical concept should be related to observations. And what we call today in economics the revealed preference paradigm is the idea that your utility is something that I measure from your behavior. It's not that I can figure it out on my own because I'm so smart, but rather I look at what you do, and if you are sufficiently consistent to have a utility, to be described as if you are maximizing utility, that's what I'm going to call your utility function. So me as an outside observer, observing your choices and saying, oh, he behaves as if he's maximizing this utility. And the same idea came with expected utility. And then were fantastically beautiful axiomatic works by Bruno De Finetti on probability, John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern in the context of expected utility with given probabilities. And then the work of Leonard Savage about putting these things together, which is to show that if, when you make decisions, you are sufficiently coherent in a well-defined way. There are several things that we call axioms, assumptions about your behavior, which are mostly assumptions about coherence. If you made this decision here and that decision there, then probably you make another decision there with some logic. Then you behave as if you have a utility function and you have a probability, which is going to be your own subjective probability, such that an outside observer can describe your behavior by maximization of expected utility. So this idea of Pascal got to be in the 1950s, got to be sort of re-established or proposed again, but this time with very solid axiomatic foundations, by which I mean there are conditions about behavior that are equivalent to this mathematical formulation. And this axiomatization, namely this axiomatic system that is equivalent, shown to be mathematically equivalent to this particular model, convinced the profession basically that this is the right way to make decisions. This is what rationality is about. And it was a little bit slow, but within a few decades, this became the main workhorse of economic theory, game theory, decision theory, both for describing how people behave and for suggesting how people should behave, what we call the normative approach, which is sort of more preaching, saying that's the right way to make decisions. It has remained dominant for many years. It has been challenged here and there. There were works by Maurice Allais in the 50s, Daniel Ellsberg in the 60s, but by and large, not a lot of challenge from evidence, let's say, until the works of Kahneman, Tversky, and their followers, who in the 70s and 80s and later on showed that many of these assumptions don't really hold and individuals don't really behave according to these assumptions. Very nicely designed experiments that got people thinking as to what do we do with a theory? Does it describe how people behave? And if not, what should we do about it? Today we are at a point where we have, I think, two very impressive bodies of literature. One comes from decision theory, game theory, microeconomic theory, operations research, which describes what I would call the rational choice paradigm, for lack of a better word. I don't want to choose the word theory for reasons I'll explain in a second. But it's a very beautiful construction, very elegant, that shows how mathematics can help us in describing decision-making, in recommending decisions, and so on. On the other hand, we have a very impressive body of psychological findings that show that almost nothing works. Amos Tversky used to say, give me the axiom, I'll come up with the experiment that violates it. And indeed, there are lots of works of his and Danny Kahneman and their followers that show that almost everything you write down doesn't always work. And the question is, what do we do between the two? Okay? And my thought on this is that we can take one of two approaches when we see theory and reality that don't conform to each other. One thing, which is normal in all sciences, is to say, okay, let's improve the theory and get it closer to reality. Just improve it, refine it in a Popperian way. This is what we should be doing to falsify the old theory and come up with a better one. But in the social sciences, there's the other possibility, and this is to bring reality closer to theory by teaching people. Because we can say, look, if you make mistakes in, say, conditional probabilities, Maybe I can teach you how to do it better. Maybe I can go to high schools and teach kids how to calculate conditional probabilities. Yes, I can exploit it in, say, a marketing setup and say people make mistakes, so let me maybe make money out of that. But another approach would be to say, let's teach them and maybe they will not make so many mistakes. Which one should we choose? I'm trying to promote a definition of rationality which is precisely based on this distinction. Namely, if I can talk to people and show them that they don't follow the theory, and then they say, oh my God, I was stupid, next time I'll do better, and they actually do better, then I say it was irrational for them, because by preaching the theory, I can make them change their behavior. If on the other hand, I preach the theory and I jump up and down and I teach and I talk and I tell jokes, but at the end of the day, they're left cold and they keep behaving in the same way, what good have I done? So I would say that probably for them, it's rational, okay? So I'm trying to promote a definition of rationality that's not about, wisdom or mathematical sophistication. And in general, it's not like a title or honorary title that I, the decision theorist, bestow upon you, the decision maker. Rather, I view the role of a decision theorist as someone who's supposed to help a decision maker in their own eyes. So I have to go back to you and say, do you feel more comfortable with the decisions you make now? Or do you feel less comfortable with the way you behaved before and maybe this model can help you? To the extent that I can convince you, you were irrational before, you're maybe more rational now. To the extent I can convince you, I can call you names, but as far as I'm concerned, you're rational in the sense that the theory cannot change your behavior. So of the examples of violations of the classical theory, there are many that are definitely irrational in the sense that most people feel uncomfortable about the way they behave. And you have a feeling that next time they'll behave closer to the theory. But not all are such. So in particular, if we go back to the question of probabilities, people sometimes do not satisfy the axioms of Leonard Savage in the 1950s. And then you show this to them. You say, look, you behaved in this way, and here is a very pretty axiom with beautiful logic. Now what do you do? And my point is, so let's say that a couple of people, including David Schmeiler, who used to be my advisor, and others, are arguing that it's not always rational to satisfy these axioms because there are situations where you just cannot come up with probabilities, and then maybe it is more rational to admit that than to pretend that you can. So even though the axioms look very pretty, sometimes it's not extremely practical. And there are some situations where assigning probabilities to things is seems to be completely unfounded. So just to a quick example, suppose that I come up with two terms you've never heard of, like arbodites and cyclophines, and I ask you, do you think that all arbodites are cyclophines? And you've never heard these terms. Now, if you do assign probabilities to everything, which is what's called the Bayesian approach, then you should tell me, yes, with probability 62% or 59% or whatever. And the point is that you have no idea. Okay? If you could try to say 50-50, I'll ask you, what about maybe all cyclophines are arbodites? Maybe these are two disjoint sets. Maybe the metacyclophines are a separate type of pseudo-arbodite. I mean, I can make up words to say, look, at some point you say, I don't know. And the problem with assigning probabilities to everything is that you cannot tell in this language, I do not know. Okay? If you say, I have no idea, I'll ask you, how much do you not know? Do you not know 0.6 or 0.7? And the language does not have the statement to say, I don't have the foggiest idea. So in this sense, we feel that it's not necessarily the most rational, and we test it by talking to people and saying, okay, you behaved in a way that contradicts the axioms. Now, do you want to change your behavior? And often they say, no, just because I don't have any idea how to assign probabilities to that, I do not. And part of the recent work in recent decades is coming up with different decision theories that would allow for situations where you don't have probabilities for all events.
It's a difficult question because first we have to understand in a precise way what we mean by economic behavior. It's not so obvious. We can understand this phrase economic behavior at least two levels. One is the individual level, and for instance, I have an economic behavior in the sense maybe that I optimize something. I'm an optimizer. So I will speak about that in a more precise way. And the other way we can address this question is at the collective level, the aggregate level. What is an economic organization? How we recognize an economic organization? What kind of economic behaviors make up an economic organization? So, for instance, there are some social animals, ants, bees, animals like that, or even other animals we don't think of. At the aggregate level, do they have an economic behavior? Do they exemplify an economy? So this is a very difficult question. So I have to divide my talk between those two aspects and then try to make sense of them together. First, at the individual level, in economics, or at least in bioeconomics or neuroeconomics, we use animal models. We use animals in order to understand human economic behavior. What does it mean? It means that those animals, obviously, they try to maximize something. They try to survive in their environments. They try to optimize their fitness, for instance. So we have a set of evolutionary considerations about those animals, and the classical, very standard economic models, microeconomic models that we can use, capture very well those behaviors. In fact, to some extent, microeconomic models capture even more animal behavior, basic individual animal behavior, than human behavior. So this is very interesting. But this is the very individual level. And in a sense, it's not specific enough. We are talking about the basic biological, evolutionary, evolved behavior, maximizing one's utility, survive. Is it enough to speak of economic behavior? This is something that we find everywhere in nature. Even plants, in fact, in that sense, exemplify economic behavior. I'm interested into plant economics those days, but you see the distance between plants and humans. So it's a too broad a notion, in fact. So let's go back to the other aspect, the collective aspect, the social aspect. In order to recognize in nature economic behavior, we can speak of observing a certain organization. For instance, division of labor. Some do that, some others do that. We can see that. We can observe that in ants colonies, in beehives. Is it an economy in a serious sense? Do we observe an economy in a beehive or in an ants colony? I'm not so sure. It's not because we have an appearance of collective rationality or of organization that we have an economy and that we have an economic behavior. So now I will define positively what I understand by economic behavior. It's something in the between individual behavior and between social organization. So it's not so sure that an ant or a bee exemplify an economic behavior, even though it belongs to a kind of society. And also an animal in isolation or a human in isolation, even though it optimizes its survival, it's not so sure that it exemplifies economic behavior. We need something in the middle. We need something that connects the society or social organization and individual behavior. This is where I think the problem lies. So the problem is one of some animals like us have developed very complex social environment. To be sure, with a division of labor, with specialization, with trades, exchanges, speculation over the future. The temporal element is very important. The sequential element is very important, that we can foresee, that we make intertemporal choices, sequential choices. Animals can do that. So in that extent, animals have economic behavior because they place their immediate behavior into an intertemporal structure. Some animals can do that. For instance, some birds can do that. Blue jays are reputed for being able to make intertemporal choices, to foresee the future to some extent, to store some goods in view of future consumption. So economic behavior should be defined as having a dual component, connecting a certain kind of individual optimal behavioral patterns to a social organization. And this is very interesting because this is where the problem lies for people interested like me in the biology of economics or even in neuroeconomics, because sometimes the two don't fit. In the past 20 or 30 years, or even more than that, a lot of behavioral economists have noticed that we don't optimize all the time. And some of them have referred this non-optimal behavior to our biological fabric, the way that our brain is wired to certain environments, but not to other environments. So in some environment, we are not optimizers, but in some other environments, we optimize. So there is something like a fitness between a brain, or in more general terms, I would say a cognitive systems, which is biologically realized, and a certain type of environments. So the degree of fitness between the two is what defines for me the optimality of economic behavior. It's not only the cognitive system itself, it's not only the social structure itself that are optimal, it's the fit between the two that defines optimal or non-optimal economic behavior. So interestingly, I hold a general hypothesis about this, which is that for us humans, we have developed, as I said before, very sophisticated, very complex economic environments in which we are not always optimal, in which it's not possible or not even sometimes desirable to maximize some utility, to maximize some satisfaction. Okay? And this is part, in fact, of our biological reality, because not optimizing may be optimal, in fact. If we think of the connection between our brains, or us as cognitive systems, and the environment we have built. But on the other hand, there are some other problems. There is what I call a functional lag, maybe. A functional lag between the abilities, the biological abilities and cognitive abilities we have developed across our evolution, and the environment we have built. Maybe we have built too much a complex environment, an environment which is too complex for our brains to continue to adapt to this very environment that we have built. And maybe the idea of a bias, the idea of non-optimality, can be referred to this functional lag between the environment we ourselves have built and our abilities as they come, how they are rooted in our evolution, you see? So if we come back to bees and ants, I don't see any kind of functional lags between those cognitive systems, those biological systems, which are ants or bees or other animals, and the ant colonies or the beehives or the particular environment in which those animals evolve, move every day, they live in. There is like a fundamental adequacy, adaptivity. But by contrast, us humans, we have built maybe some environments in which we are not so much adapted today. And this is, I think, where there is a new possibility of research to understand what we have called biases in the past 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. You know, behavioral economists have said we should incorporate biases into our economic model. In fact, this is one way of doing things. My way of doing things is to say those biases maybe reflect some fundamental, recent in terms of evolution, inadaptability, inadequacy between our basic biological capacities and economic environments. One aspect of complexity of our environments in which we have to make decisions is the temporal structure of those environments, the fact that we have to plan for the future, or also the fact that our decisions can be sequential, one step now, one step later, and we have to foresee all those steps. So interestingly, in economics, in experimental economics, we have tested our ability to deal with those temporal structures. It is what is called intertemporal choice theory. And we have documented, as I said, a lot of biases with respect to those decisions. We display impatience. We are not able to foresee the future. We discount the future utility. Interestingly, we have used blue jays. Some people have used blue jays, and I've studied blue jays in that respect. Blue jays, they fail when we give them binary choice, one choice, one reward, one bigger reward later and one lesser reward now. They always go to the lesser reward, so they display impatience, they discount utility. But now, if we change the environment, and if we make the environment more sequential, and if we give the possibility in that environment to go forward and backward like that, to move across time, then they are optimal. So you see that documenting a bias in experimental economics, depends on the way we formalize and the way we implement the structure of the decision environment. If we move the environment, sometimes the bias disappear. So this is exactly the topic that I wanted to illustrate. I want to illustrate that the problem is not making a decision on one side and having an environment or a structure on the other side, but it is the interplay between the decision and the environment that will define whether we are optimal or not, and whether our evolution have developed some good adaptive decision mechanism in order to optimize in that environment. This is where the problem of the study of economic behavior and the biology of economic behavior lies, I think. I think that in neuroeconomics today there is a misunderstanding, an important misunderstanding, because there is not enough connection between, on the one hand, the neuroscience of decision making, and on the other hand, decision theory, which is a branch of economics, of economic theory, of mathematics even. And so there are two communities, two scientific communities, who try to address a subject, a unique topic, but they don't speak to each other so well. The topic is, what is decision? What is a decision? How should we model decision? How should we understand our ability to make decisions? And my idea is to connect those two communities. I'm not the only one, of course, to want to do that, but the idea is to connect those two communities, and I'm not so sure that we reach a level of a mutual understanding. So I will try to see where the problems lie and how we could do in order to make those two communities speak to each other beyond the tag neuroeconomics, which is not enough to define the existence of a joint community. So what is a decision? For some neuroscientists working on decision making, on the neuroscience of decision making, decision could be defined, and I will borrow my definition to a very prominent neuroscientist in that field, Shadlan. Decision could be defined as the capacity to refrain immediacy. So we have a stimulus, we have a reward, and instead of processing this reward now, or being satisfied immediately by this reward, we pause. Oh, is it a good reward? Is it a bad reward? Should I consider something else? Are there any other options in the background? What would be the consequence for me of accepting this reward, of postponing this reward maybe? And this is a decision. So decision is intrinsically linked to the capacity to defer, to delay reward, in fact. This is one way of defining a decision. If we do that, we have everything that we need in neuroscience and even maybe in philosophy and decision theory in order to understand what a decision is about. Decision is about to, as I said, consider other options, think about the future. So it's already a complex cognitive framework that we have opened here. Maybe free will too. If I refrain from immediate reward, it means that I exert some kind of free will and some kind of deliberation. So we have to postpone. It's also linked to time, to the way the brain processes time, and to the way the brain processes its own reaction to its environment. So this is very interesting. A decision can be very quickly implemented in the brain. It's a matter of milliseconds. But thinking about a decision is a very long process compared to that. So this is in this contrast, in this temporal contrast that the decision lies. So neuroscientists, they are mainly interested, or at least neuroscientists like Shadland, for instance, are mainly interested in this topic. And I feel very close to this kind of neuroscience, in fact, because this is neuroscience trying to understand some deep philosophical issues: free will, decision-making, responsibility. Okay. On the other hand, we have decision theory, which at first blush has nothing to do with that. It has an idea of a decision as a very abstract model. We have preferences over a set of options, and we try to maximize our utility given those preferences. So the vocabulary even is very different. So how could we try to make those two things fit together? I'm not so sure that most neuroscientists know or are very interested in decision theory. And the reverse is even truer. I'm not so sure, not even sure, that decision theorists are not interested in neuroscience. Because why? Because, in fact, for them, the way the brain or animals maybe make decisions has nothing to do clearly with what they try to model at a very abstract level. And I don't agree with that. I think that we should develop a decision theory which is in connection with neuroscience or with biology or with psychology, in fact. I wish to develop a decision theory which is homeomorphic to the way we are. What does it mean? I borrow this phrase homeomorphic to a very prominent decision theorist, Peter Walker, who contrasts between paramorphic models in decision theory and homeomorphic models in decision theory. Paramorphic models are models that model decisions in abstraction from what we do, in fact. The mathematics is not connected to what we do, okay? It's something else. It's an as-if model. Homeomorphic models, those are the models that try to make sure that the logical ingredients, the logical steps that we find in the models reflect to some extent what we do in reality when we make a decision. So there is a kind of homeomorphism between decision making, as we do it, and decision theory. So it's difficult, because as I said, the neuroscience of decision making is interested by some processes in the brain, maybe some inhibition processes in the brain, for instance, not responding to a reward too soon, and decision theory models the connection between preferences on one side, the algebra of preferences, and a utility function. Nothing to do. I mean, very two different universes. So how to connect that? I will give my own recipe and see whether it works or not. My recipe is that decision theory, I mean the abstract part of decision theory in economics, in economic theory, in fact, speaks about a psychological ability, speaks about the same ability that we study in neuroscience, the ability to make decisions. It speaks in a certain way, with a certain vocabularies, with a certain ontology, but it speaks of it. So we should try to model this very fact, mathematically, in fact. Do we have preferences? Can we see preferences in the brain? Do we have beliefs? Can we see beliefs in the brain? I don't think that we can see such things in the brain, but what we can see is, for instance, at a behavioral level, when we make inconsistent preferences, for instance, by violating transitivity or something like that, some basic rational patterns that we should observe when we make differences, otherwise we're not rational. When we violate transitivity of preferences, for instance, or when we have inconsistent beliefs. I believe A, and 2 minutes later I believe non-A. This is inconsistent logically. When we do that, maybe without realizing that at first, is there something in the brain that happens that say, oh, there is a mistake here, okay? So maybe we don't see preferences, we don't see this kind of algebraic structure in the brain, we don't see probabilities in the brain, subjective probabilities in the brain. I'm sure that we can see that. Some people say that they can see that, but I'm not so sure that they have seen that. But maybe what we can see is when we don't comply with those models, those basic probabilistic structures or basic preferential structures, when we don't comply with them, when we make some mistakes from a normative point of view, maybe we realize that more or less consciously. Maybe there is something in the brain that say, oh, mistake here. So there is a conflict, probably in the anterior cingulate cortex taking place. And I am interested in those markers. I call them neuromarkers of rationality. Here we have a little point. It's a bit like the pineal gland in Descartes connecting the body and the soul, but it's not like that. It's something in the brain, maybe in the ACC, that says, oh, that connects some views about our rationality and some action we perform and that are not so good for us, or that we realize are not so good, so we should refrain from doing that. And this is again decision, in fact. So I think there are some ways to connect a decision theory and the neuroscience of decision making. So just let me tell you about an experiment that I ran some years ago about a very famous paradox in decision theory, which is the violate paradox, and which amounts to a violation of the axiom of independence in decision theory. That the fact that if we have two options and they have a common part, we should make our decision without taking into account that common part. We should take decision only into account the part that differs, because this is where the important information lies. So some people just don't do that. Most people, in fact, don't do that in some context. They violate this principle of independence, and so they reach some inconsistent decisions. Okay? So this is a very famous experiment, a very famous paradox in decision theory, and I did, in fact, run that experiment with some brain lesion patients in a hospital in Paris and in other hospital in Toronto. Those patients, they had a lesion in the frontal cortex. Actually, it was a behavioral frontal variant dementia. And so we gave them the ALE problems with this problem of independence. And most people, as I said, most non-lesion persons, they violate the axiom of independence. And those people didn't violate. None of them did violate the axiom of independence. They were perfectly rational. Well, this is a published paper that shows that some brain lesion patients are more rational as far as the independence axiom is concerned than healthy subjects. Or is this a problem? Should we have a part of the brain lesion in order to be rational? You see that if we follow decision theory in its prescription of not violating the axiom of independence, it means that it will be easier for us to just cut a part of our brain. That's a problem, I think. So it means that here there is a kind of discrepancy between the brain as it is and decision theory. So it doesn't mean that decision theory should be taken too normatively or prescriptively. It's only mathematical construction or philosophical construction. It's an abstraction that describes to some extent what happens in the brain and what we do, and that should describe even more what happens in the brain and what we do, but not into a direct way, because otherwise we'll find not the ALE paradox, but the paradox of brain lesion persons not violating the ALE paradox. What is money? For most people, money is what you earn. It's a reward. And the beginning of neuroeconomics of money, if there is such a thing, is to the study of monetary rewards in the brain. But I don't think it defines clearly the field, or fully the field. Okay, money is a reward. We know that. And we know that money, as a reward, activates some areas in the brain, like sex or drugs, or any kind of reward, or primary reward. So the problem is whether money is only a primary reward. I don't think so. Money is a primary reward, but it's also what we call a secondary reward. It's a primary reinforcer. We enjoy having money a lot. It even affects our bodily states, our behavior. When we have money, a lot of money, I don't have money on me, but when we have money like that, you see, a lot of money like that, I feel great, really. This has been shown by people like Cathy Vos, for instance, the impact of money on bodily states. But it's not enough. Money is not only like that. If I take, it's a small bill, but you see there are some figures, there are some symbols on it. So I know that I can use this only in Russia. If I go back to Paris, nobody will want that. Say, oh, it's interesting. It's a picture? No. So money is also a very abstract thing. And I think the neuroeconomics of money should not be interested only in the reward aspect, but also in the abstract, symbolic, cultural aspect. And this is what I am interested in. So how we go from a primary reward to a secondary reward. This is the first neuroscientific question we can ask about money. Second question is how we deal with the abstract features of money. How do we recognize that this is good for Russia, but this is not good for France or the United States? This is not good, no use. Can the brain know that? So a few years ago with a colleague of mine in Paris, Catherine Talon-Baudry, and students of ours at that time, Florent Méniel, we ran a very, very basic experiment. We use coins. Coins, euro coins, 1 euro, 1 franc, no more franc at that time in France, 1 Australian dollar, 1 Finnish mark. So our subjects, they knew the franc and the euro coins, but they had never met with the Australian dollar coin or the Finnish mark coin. They didn't know that, they haven't seen that, we checked for that. And we put them in a brain imaging setting, in EMG, and we were observing the reaction of the brain when they saw those coins. We asked them not to say what coin it is, but just to click when they saw twice in a row the same coin. And we analyzed the data, the brain activity when they viewed those coins. And what we observed was very strange, in fact. We observed that the familiarity with the coin, the fact that they haven't seen the Australian mark or the fact that they had seen the franc made no difference in the brain. The familiarity had no impact on the recognition of the brain, the visual recognition of the coin, sorry. This is one result. The second result is that the brain processes those visual stimuli and make the difference between valid coin and non-valid coin very quickly. Valid coin in the sense that you can use the euro today, you can use the Australian dollar, but you cannot use anymore the franc or the Finnish mark. So this is a very abstract notion, the fact that you can use those coins or not in some context. This is very abstract. And the brain could decode this in 150 milliseconds, which is very, very fast. So no impact of familiarity and automaticity or fastness of the processing of the validity aspect, namely the abstract aspect of the currency. This is very strange because if you consider recognizing a word belonging to a natural language, if I say Parju Georgia, pretending to speak Russian, but it's obviously not Russian, even if you're a Russian speaker, it will take 450 seconds, 50 milliseconds or something like that to recognize that this is not a word of your natural language. This is an abstract thing, recognizing whether a word belongs to a natural language or not. But recognizing whether a coin belongs to this nation, or at least has some purchasing power now, in our experiment takes only 150 milliseconds. For a cultural thing, for a conventional thing, this is remarkably fast. So this is something that, for me, is at the core of what we can call the neuroeconomics of money. How the brain developed an ability to process such an abstract feature as monetary validity by seeing some coins, some visual stimuli. How is it possible? I mean, for words it takes more time. Language is a natural ability, but for words it takes more time. For coins, which is very cultural, very abstract, very conventional, which is an economic artifact, which is very recent from an historical or evolutionary perspective. It's only 7,000 years ago that we can see the first coins in Lydia. So how did the brain do that? We have an hypothesis that we share with some neuroscientists, or at least some neuroscientists like Stanislas Dehaene in Paris, for instance, has this view that the brain has recycled some old evolutionary neural pathways in order to process with novelties, with cultural novelties. But he speaks about reading or numbers, not about coins. So to carry over this hypothesis of a cultural recycling of cortical networks in order to process cultural novelty to the economic realm is a step that is a little bit daring. I try to make this step, in fact, to see whether, in fact, we develop some special abilities in the past 1,000 years in order to deal with the economic artifacts that we created in our recent history, human history. That could be the case for coins. In our experiment, we noticed that the main validity effect, the fact that people could recognize the validity or the invalidity of the coin, the main validity effect took place in the fusiform gyrus, which is a little part of the visual brain, which is dedicated to the recognition of faces, of human faces. So in this area of the brain, I can process faces, something which is a face or not a face. I can categorize faces. I can also maybe categorize in the fusiform gyrus whether some food is energetic or not. So broadly, I could say that in this area of the brain, I can maybe recognize what is good and what is not good, what is a face, what is not a face. There is a categorization taking place here, maybe in terms of validity. So maybe what we discovered is not specific to coins, but specific to the classification of something valid and something invalid, something good or something not good. Good for us, not good for us. Good for survival, not good for survival. It's important to recognize whether this is a human face or something else. It is important to recognize whether this is poison or whether this is good food for me, in evolutionary terms. So maybe we recycle some kind of activity like that in order to recognize, oh, this coin is good, this coin is not good for what I need to do today. Okay? So this is an idea of cultural recycling that I borrowed to some other people in some other fields. This is a very speculative idea. And this could be the beginning of a new economics of money. It's not the only thing that we can say about money in the brain. Money is the brain. Money is very composite, is a very hybrid item in the world. It's, as I said, a material object and a very symbolic object. It's very dual. Is the interface of something very biological and something very cultural. A primary reinforcer like sex and drug or food, and a very cultural item relying on a convention, relying on boundaries, on countries, stuff like that. So it's something very complicated, where to locate money in the spectrum of human production or biological production. So neuroeconomics of money can be interested, I said, for the moment, in two things. The transition from primary reward to secondary reward. That was the first thing. Second thing is how we deal with this very cultural item in a very automatic way, in a very fast way. How the brain can do that, and how maybe it recycled some basic evolutionary abilities, or biological abilities, in order to process with those cultural items. That was the two first ideas. Now, if we want to pursue a research program, as I do, that would be called the neuroeconomics of money, we have to connect economic theory and biology or neuroscience, as usual. We have to connect those two things. So which part of economic theory can we use that could fit with a biological research program? This is not obvious. So the idea here is the following. In the recent years, some views on money are what we can call micro-foundational. They are interested in individual behavior, in the emergence of money at a very individual microeconomic level. Not money simply as a macroeconomic phenomenon, as something that the central bank controls in terms of input or output of money, for instance, in a country, but something at the very individual level. This is the Menger's hypothesis in economics. Menger was an Austrian economist who thought about the emergence of money at a very individual level. And this is where the neuroeconomics of money can take some inspiration. So now if you think that you have something, I have something, but we don't want to exchange those things, okay? No barter. And there is somebody else somewhere who has something else that maybe interests us. Okay, but it's out of reach for the moment. So maybe we need some money in order to organize this exchange. So at a very basic level, we need to understand that you have something, that I have something, but maybe our wants don't coincide. But if we had something in the middle, a medium for exchange, that would go. So we need some strategic ability. We need some beliefs about your needs, my needs, the needs of other people. So we need some beliefs, in fact. So at a very basic level, we need an economic structure. We need to understand this economic structure, trade, how it functions, and we need to understand the beliefs of others, some strategizing or theory of mind abilities, in fact. This is called like this. So maybe money depends on those beliefs that we have, and those beliefs, they have a biological realization. And the meeting of beliefs in the world also, some people say today, have some biological markers. So maybe the study of money is connected to the study of the theory of mind in neuroscience. This is one thing. We have to understand the way we coordinate, the way we cooperate. And this is a very big program in neuroeconomics today, a program that doesn't touch to money so far, but that could, in fact. So the study of money is in fact a connection. This is the third aspect of a research program on the neuroeconomics of money, could touch upon the way our belief structures are implemented and the way the economic structure function. It is the meeting between a cognitive systems with some basic learning abilities, belief abilities, and an economic fundamental structure. This is where we can develop, I think, a research program in this field of money.